The fastest way to destroy an honest person is not to prove they are guilty. It is to make everyone believe it before they have the chance to speak. My name is Ethan Carter, and until the worst Tuesday of my life, I believed hard work always spoke louder than politics. I had spent 9 years building a reputation that no paycheck could buy. I arrived before sunrise, stayed long after sunset, and treated every spreadsheet, forecast, and quarterly report as if my own name was printed across the company logo. Hawthorne Financial was not just where I worked. It was where I imagined retiring someday. At 32 years old, I had finally reached the moment every ambitious analyst dreamed about. My promotion to senior finance manager had already been approved by human resources, and all that remained was a brief meeting with the executive leadership team before the announcement became official. My coworkers smiled as I walked through the office that morning. Some congratulated me quietly, while others joked that I would soon be too important to eat lunch with them. I laughed because life finally felt predictable in the best possible way. My apartment overlooked the Chicago River. My fiancée, Emily, and I had already begun touring venues for our wedding the following spring. My parents had booked flights from Colorado to celebrate the promotion that weekend. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly as I had planned. Even Richard Holloway, our regional finance director, greeted me with unusual warmth. Richard was the kind of executive everyone respected because he never appeared rattled. His tailored suits, polished speeches, and calm smile made investors trust him instantly. He shook my hand that morning and said, "Big day, Ethan. You earned this." Hearing those words from him meant more than I wanted to admit. He had been my mentor since my first year with the company. Whenever younger employees asked whose career they should model, I always answered with Richard's name. Looking back now, I wonder if monsters are easier to recognize after they stop pretending to be human. At 10:45, I reviewed the final budget projections one last time before heading toward the executive conference room. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Proud of you. Dinner is on me tonight." I smiled, slipped the phone into my pocket, and imagined calling my parents during lunch with the good news. I never made that call. Before I reached the conference room, 2 people I had never seen before stepped out of the elevator wearing dark business attire and visitor badges marked internal audit. Behind them walked Karen from Human Resources, her expression unusually tense. She avoided looking directly at me. Richard emerged from the conference room only seconds later. His confident smile had disappeared, replaced by a face that seemed carefully rehearsed to express disappointment. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we need you to come with us." I laughed awkwardly, assuming there had been some misunderstanding with the audit schedule. "Sure," I replied. "Can this wait until after the promotion meeting?" No one answered. One auditor opened a folder thick with printed documents, while the other asked for my company identification badge. The hallway suddenly felt silent, even though dozens of employees were only a few feet away. Conversations stopped. Computer keyboards went quiet. Every eye turned toward me. Richard folded his hands in front of him and sighed heavily, as though whatever was happening hurt him personally. Then he spoke the sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. "Ethan Carter," he said, "there are serious questions regarding unauthorized financial transactions connected to your employee credentials, and until we complete our investigation, you are being removed from all company systems effective immediately." I stood there. I wish it were. Now they avoided making eye contact, afraid that speaking to me might somehow damage their own careers. The auditors escorted me to a small conference room where a printed report already waited on the table. Across the top were the words "Financial Misconduct Investigation." Underneath were pages filled with transaction records, approval logs, login histories, and authorization codes. Every page carried my employee identification number. Every timestamp appeared legitimate. Every digital approval belonged to my credentials. I stared at the documents, unable to understand what I was seeing. One auditor slid another page toward me. "Can you explain why 3 separate wire transfers totaling $3.2 million were approved using your account over the past 6 weeks?" I looked at the dates. During one of those transfers, I had been attending a budgeting workshop in another state. Another occurred late on a Saturday evening while I was having dinner with Emily. I remembered those days clearly because they had nothing to do with work. "I never approved these," I answered. "Then how do you explain the login records?" the auditor asked calmly. I had no answer. According to the report, My account had logged into the secure financial system from my assigned workstation inside headquarters. Security badge records showed my badge entering the building. Camera snapshots captured someone who appeared to be me walking through restricted areas. Even electronic approval certificates matched my digital signature. Every piece of evidence fit together perfectly, except for one impossible fact. None of it had actually happened. Someone is using my identity, I insisted. Please check the original server data. There has to be something missing. The auditors exchanged brief glances, but revealed nothing. They simply continued asking questions while writing notes after each response. Every answer I gave sounded weaker than the documents lying in front of me. Facts printed on paper always seem more believable than the truth spoken by a frightened person. Nearly 2 hours later, they informed me that my access to every company system had been permanently suspended until the investigation concluded. My company email disappeared before I even reached the parking garage. My employee health benefits were temporarily frozen. My corporate credit card was canceled immediately. Even my employee profile vanished from the internal directory. It was as though 9 years of loyal service had been erased with a few clicks. Outside the building, I sat alone inside my car for nearly 20 minutes before calling Emily. She answered on the second ring with excitement still in her voice. So, should I make reservations? I could not speak for several seconds. Finally, I whispered, something went wrong. After listening quietly to everything that had happened, she said exactly what any reasonable person would say. If you did not do this, they will figure it out. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But deep inside, I already understood something she did not. Someone had not simply accused me. Someone had built an entire reality around my guilt, one convincing enough that every document, every system, every camera, and every trusted colleague now pointed in exactly the same direction. As I drove away from Hawthorne Financial for what I believed might be the last time, I looked once in the rearview mirror. Through the glass entrance, I could see Richard Holloway standing in the lobby, calmly watching my car disappear into traffic before turning away without the slightest sign of concern. The following morning, I woke up hoping the entire nightmare had been nothing more than an unbelievably vivid dream. Instead, reality greeted me before I even climbed out of bed. My phone displayed 14 missed calls, dozens of unread messages, and 3 emails from attorneys representing Hawthorne Financial. The official notice informed me that the company had begun a full internal investigation and that I was prohibited from contacting current employees regarding the matter. One sentence stood out more than the rest. Failure to comply could be interpreted as interference with the investigation. Overnight, I had gone from a respected financial professional to someone being treated as a potential criminal. Emily sat quietly across the kitchen table while I reread every page for the 3rd time. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You are going to clear your name," she said gently. I wanted to answer with confidence, but confidence requires something solid to stand on. All I had were my memories, and memories carried far less weight than electronic records. Before noon, the story had spread farther than I imagined possible. A former coworker sent me a screenshot from a business networking site where someone had posted that a senior analyst at Hawthorne Financial was under investigation for suspected financial misconduct. My name was not officially mentioned, but anyone who knew about my promotion could easily connect the dots. Within hours, people who had congratulated me only a day earlier suddenly stopped responding to my messages. One recruiter who had contacted me every few months about leadership opportunities quietly withdrew an interview invitation without explanation. Another simply replied that the position had already been filled. I understood what had really happened. Nobody wanted to take a chance on someone surrounded by questions. That afternoon, I met with an employment attorney named Daniel Brooks. His office overlooked downtown Chicago, and his walls were lined with awards recognizing decades of successful litigation. He listened carefully without interrupting as I explained everything from the promotion meeting to the audit documents. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked only one question. "Can you prove that those records are false?" I answered honestly, "No." He nodded slowly. "Then the company currently has more evidence than you do." Hearing those words from someone whose job was to defend people like me felt like watching the last light disappear before nightfall. Daniel explained that digital evidence carried enormous credibility in court, especially when supported by badge access logs, surveillance footage, authentication records, and financial approvals. He promised to represent me, but he also warned me not to expect a quick resolution. Cases involving corporate fraud investigations often lasted months or even years. As I drove home, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. He had already heard that my promotion celebration had been canceled. I could hear concern in his voice, but I also heard something else. Confusion. He wanted to believe me, yet he was struggling to understand how so much evidence could point toward his son if none of it were true. I reassured him that everything would work out, even though I no longer believed those words myself. By evening, the apartment that Emily and I had spent months decorating suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every unopened wedding brochure on the coffee table reminded me of plans built on a future that now seemed uncertain. Emily insisted nothing had changed between us, but I noticed she became unusually quiet whenever another notification appeared on my phone. She trusted me completely, yet the constant flood of headlines, rumors, and legal emails created an invisible pressure neither of us could ignore. Before going to bed, I opened the drawer of my home office to gather documents Daniel had requested. Tax returns, employment reviews, performance awards, and years of handwritten notes filled neatly labeled folders. At the very bottom sat an old cardboard box I had not touched since moving into the apartment 2 years earlier. It contained random office supplies, outdated charging cables, a worn leather notebook, and a company-issued smartphone I had forgotten even existed. The battery had been dead for years, so I almost tossed it aside with the rest of the clutter. Instead, something made me pause. I held the dusty phone in my hand for several seconds, wondering why I had never returned it after receiving a replacement. Without realizing it, I placed the old device on my desk rather than back into the box, unaware that the smallest forgotten object in my apartment was about to become the only thing standing between the truth and the lie that had already stolen my entire life. The old company phone sat on my desk all night, like a forgotten souvenir from a different life. The next morning, while Emily left for work after reminding me not to lose hope, I found the charger buried beneath a pile of tangled cables inside the same cardboard box. I almost laughed when the charging symbol finally appeared on the cracked screen. The device had not been powered on in nearly 3 years, back when the company upgraded everyone to newer models. I only kept it because no one had ever asked for it back. While it slowly charged, I organized documents for Daniel Brooks and tried to distract myself by updating a list of every project I had worked on during my years at Hawthorne Financial. My mind kept returning to the impossible question that refused to leave me alone. If someone had stolen my identity inside the company, they had done it with extraordinary precision. They knew my schedule, my habits, my access level, and even the way I approved financial requests. This had not been an impulsive act. It had been designed patiently, piece by piece, long before anyone accused me. After lunch, the old phone finally finished booting up. Most of the applications were outdated, and several no longer functioned because the operating system had not been updated in years. I almost turned it off again when a notification appeared asking whether I wanted to restore previously synchronized company data stored locally on the device. Since the phone no longer connected to Hawthorne Financial servers, I expected nothing useful to appear. Instead, an old email application slowly opened using archived offline files that had never been deleted. Thousands of messages began loading from local storage. Most were ordinary conversations about budgets, travel reimbursements, or quarterly reports. Then something unusual caught my attention. At the very top of the draft folder was a message with no recipient listed as successfully delivered, yet it also did not appear under unsent messages. It simply carried the status pending sync. The timestamp immediately felt strange. According to the phone, the draft had been created almost 2 months before I received the replacement device, but the modified time showed activity only 7 weeks ago. That made no sense. This phone had been sitting inside a sealed cardboard box in my apartment for nearly 3 years. Nothing should have changed on it during that time. Curious, I opened the draft. At first glance, it looked incomplete. There was no subject line, no greeting, only several paragraphs describing inconsistencies in internal transfer approvals involving unusually large vendor payments. My own writing style was unmistakable. I recognized the phrasing because I always documented concerns with precise financial language before sending anything to senior management. Yet I had absolutely no memory of writing this message. Attached beneath the text was a small spreadsheet icon that could not be opened because the file itself had not synchronized correctly. I stared at the empty attachment for several minutes. If the spreadsheet had once existed, it contained information important enough for me to reference throughout the draft. Even stranger, one sentence near the end stopped me cold. It read, "Before approving next month's reconciliation, I believe Richard should personally explain these authorization patterns to legal." I read that sentence over and over. Richard, why would I have written that? Throughout my career, I had trusted him completely. I had never questioned his decisions. I certainly would never have drafted an email suggesting legal review his approvals unless something serious had already concerned me. Emily returned home just as I was taking photographs of the screen with my personal phone. I handed her the device without saying a word. She read the draft carefully before looking back at me. "Do you remember writing this?" she asked. "Not at all," I admitted. "But I remember how I worked. I never accused anyone without evidence." She studied the timestamp again. "Can anyone change this date?" "Not easily," I replied. "Especially not on a phone that has been disconnected for years." For the first time since everything collapsed, I felt something I had almost forgotten. It was not confidence. It was not relief. It was possibility. The draft itself proved nothing yet. The attachment was missing. The message had never been synchronized, and there was no indication anyone else had ever seen it. But one fact refused to leave my mind. Before anyone accused me of financial misconduct, before my promotion disappeared, before my career was destroyed, I had apparently discovered something important enough to question Richard Holloway's financial approvals. Somewhere, somehow, the missing piece connected to that unfinished message still existed, and if I could find it before someone else erased it forever, the story everyone believed about me might finally begin to fall apart. The next morning, I carried both the old company phone and my personal notebook to Daniel Brooks's office. He examined the archived draft carefully without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "This is not enough to clear your name," he said, "but it is enough to ask a different question." I looked at him hopefully. "Which question?" He tapped the screen gently. "Why would you draft an email questioning financial approvals connected to Richard Holloway before the investigation ever began?" That single sentence shifted the direction of everything. Until now, I had been trying to prove I was innocent. Daniel wanted to know who had the strongest reason to make me look guilty. He immediately filed a legal request demanding preservation of every archived email, server log, and backup associated with my employee account. Although Hawthorne Financial was not required to release the information yet, they were legally obligated to avoid destroying potential evidence once preservation had been requested. "Time matters now," Daniel warned. "If someone built this case against you, they are probably watching every step we take." Those words stayed with me as I left his office. Instead of driving home, I parked across the street from a small coffee shop where many Hawthorne employees stopped during lunch. I had no intention of contacting anyone directly because the company's legal notice prohibited that, but I hoped to observe whether anything unusual was happening. Nearly an hour passed before I noticed someone familiar walking toward the cafe. It was Mark Ellis, a senior systems administrator who had worked in the information technology department almost as long as I had worked in finance. Mark had always been quiet, the kind of employee who solved impossible technical problems without asking for recognition. As he approached the entrance, he recognized me sitting inside. His face immediately changed. He hesitated for only a second before entering anyway. "You should not be seen talking to me," I said quietly after he sat down. He looked around nervously before answering. "I cannot stay long." I did not mention the draft email. Instead, I asked a simple question. "Have there been any unusual system changes since I left?" Mark remained silent long enough for me to think he would refuse to answer. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "The backup server containing archived finance records was taken offline 3 days ago." I frowned. "For maintenance?" He slowly shook his head. "Officially, yes. Unofficially, nobody in information technology requested the shutdown." My pulse quickened. "Who approved it?" Mark looked toward the window before quietly saying, "Executive authorization." Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and immediately stood. "I have to go." "Mark," I called softly. He paused. "If someone asks, we never had this conversation." Without another word, he disappeared into the afternoon crowd. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it left me with more questions than answers. If archived finance servers were suddenly being taken offline after Daniel requested evidence preservation, that timing could not be ignored. Later that evening, Daniel called with another unexpected development. "One more thing," he said. "The company responded to my preservation notice faster than expected. Is that good?" I asked. "Not exactly. They claim several archived email repositories are temporarily unavailable because of an infrastructure migration that supposedly began last week." I immediately remembered what Mark had told me only hours earlier. The stories did not fit together. Someone was either hiding information or moving it somewhere nobody could easily reach. As if that was not enough, another surprise arrived the following morning. Emily was scrolling through the company's public employee directory when she suddenly looked at me with concern. "Ethan," she whispered, turning her laptop toward me. "Look at this." Richard Holloway had posted a company-wide announcement celebrating Hawthorne Financial's commitment to transparency and ethical leadership during ongoing internal compliance improvements. The statement praised employees for maintaining integrity during challenging circumstances. Hundreds of coworkers had already liked and commented beneath the post, congratulating leadership for protecting the company's reputation. My name never appeared once. Yet everyone reading it understood exactly who the unnamed example was supposed to be. Richard was shaping the narrative before the investigation had even ended. He was making sure the company saw him as the executive who uncovered fraud instead of the man who might have created it. I closed the laptop slowly and looked at the old phone still resting beside me on the table. The unfinished draft no longer felt like an accident. It felt like someone had interrupted a warning before it could ever reach its destination. And the harder certain people worked to control the story, the more convinced I became that somewhere behind locked servers, missing archives, and carefully managed public statements, the truth was still waiting to be found. Early the next morning, Daniel called before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. His voice sounded steady, but I had worked with enough attorneys over the past week to recognize restrained urgency. "I received something unexpected," he said. "A former employee contacted my office after hearing about your case. Less than 2 hours later, I found myself sitting across from a woman named Linda Foster in a quiet conference room. She had worked at Hawthorne Financial for almost 12 years before resigning 18 months earlier. Her resume described a successful career in vendor compliance, yet the exhaustion in her eyes suggested that leaving the company had cost her far more than a job. She studied me for several moments before speaking. "You remind me of myself," she said softly. "I believe the company would always protect people who told the truth." She explained that she had once discovered irregular vendor invoices connected to a series of consulting contracts. When she questioned the approvals, Richard personally thanked her for being thorough and promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, she was accused of violating procurement procedures. Although the company never accused her of a crime, her professional reputation suffered enough that she quietly accepted a resignation agreement instead of fighting. "I thought I had simply made someone uncomfortable," she admitted. "Now I think I was removed before I could ask the wrong questions." Daniel listened carefully while taking notes. "Did you keep any records?" he asked. Linda nodded slowly. "Only my personal notebook. The company kept everything else." She handed us a worn spiral notebook filled with handwritten dates, vendor names, and payment references. One page immediately caught my attention. Several vendor identification numbers looked strangely familiar. I recognized them because I had reviewed many of those accounts during annual budget reconciliations. Even more surprising, one vendor appeared repeatedly despite receiving approval from different departments every time. "This company again," I whispered. Daniel looked toward me. "You know them?" "Only from financial reports," I answered. "Their invoices always arrived near the end of each quarter." Linda leaned forward. "Then check how often the approval chain ended with Richard." My heart began beating faster. Later that afternoon, Daniel compared Linda's notes with public corporate filings and transaction summaries that remained legally accessible. Although we could not see confidential payment records, the pattern itself was impossible to ignore. The same consulting company appeared year after year under slightly different contract descriptions, while always remaining just below spending thresholds that required additional executive review. It was clever. Individually, nothing seemed suspicious. Collectively, the pattern suggested deliberate planning. That evening, another surprise arrived. Mark Ellis called from an unfamiliar number. He spoke quickly without greeting me. I cannot stay on the phone. What happened? I asked. Someone from executive management ordered information technology to accelerate deletion schedules for legacy system images. I froze. Deletion? After the preservation notice? Officially, they call it storage optimization, Mark replied. Unofficially, people are asking questions that never used to be asked. Before I could respond, the line disconnected. I immediately relayed everything to Daniel, who filed an emergency motion requesting that the court compel Hawthorne Financial to preserve all remaining digital archives until the investigation concluded. For the first time since my suspension, events no longer felt random. Every new discovery connected to another. Linda had been pushed out after questioning financial approvals. Archived servers suddenly became unavailable. Legacy system images were now scheduled for deletion. Richard publicly promoted transparency, while important historical records quietly disappeared behind the scenes. None of those facts proved he had framed me, but together they painted a picture far larger than one employee accused of misconduct. As midnight approached, I spread Linda's notebook, my handwritten project notes, and photographs of the archived draft email across the dining room table. Emily silently joined me, reading every page without interruption. Finally, she pointed to a date inside Linda's notebook. Look at this. The notation matched almost exactly with the month my unfinished draft had first been created. We exchanged a long glance. For weeks I had believed someone targeted me because I was convenient. Now another possibility emerged, one far more disturbing than anything I had imagined. I was not the beginning of the story. I was simply the latest person who had come close enough to the truth that someone decided my career was expendable. For nearly a week, every new lead seemed to disappear just as quickly as it appeared. The archived draft email remained our only direct clue, and without its missing attachment, it was still nothing more than an unanswered question. Then, late on a Friday afternoon, Daniel called with the first genuinely encouraging news since my suspension. The court had granted part of his emergency preservation request, forcing Hawthorne Financial to produce an inventory of all archived communication systems related to the finance department. They still did not have to release the records immediately, but they could no longer deny that those systems existed. More importantly, they had accidentally revealed something they never intended to disclose. Buried inside the inventory was a reference to an offline disaster recovery archive maintained separately from the primary email servers. Daniel explained that large corporations often kept isolated backups for legal compliance, and those backups were rarely altered because doing so could violate retention policies. If my unfinished message had ever reached that archive before synchronization failed, there was a chance the complete version still existed. We immediately filed another request seeking access to that specific archive. Hawthorne Financial resisted, arguing that restoring legacy backups would require excessive cost and technical effort. Their objection only strengthened Daniel's suspicion. Companies fight over expensive requests all the time, he told me. But they usually do not fight this hard unless they are afraid of what someone might find. 3 days later, an independent technology specialist appointed by the court supervised the restoration process. Neither I nor Daniel could enter the company's secure data center, but we received regular updates throughout the afternoon. Every hour felt longer than the last. Just before 6 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel spoke before I could even say hello. They found your archived mailbox. I stopped breathing for a moment. Is the draft there? Yes, he answered. And it was never just a draft. My knees nearly gave out as I lowered myself into a chair. Daniel continued carefully, choosing every word with precision. During the restoration process, technicians discovered that the message had actually been prepared for automatic synchronization from my old company phone. The transmission had begun but failed because the device had been replaced before the synchronization completed. The primary server stored only an incomplete draft, but the disaster recovery archive preserved a hidden transaction log showing every component that had been queued for delivery. That included the missing attachment. Early the next morning, Daniel and I reviewed the recovered material together under strict legal supervision. The spreadsheet itself contained nothing dramatic at first glance. Rows of vendor payments, approval numbers, timestamps, and internal authorization codes filled dozens of pages. Then Daniel pointed toward a column labeled secondary authorization metadata. Every suspicious payment carried the same executive override identifier. Richard Holloway's administrative approval token appeared repeatedly, even in transactions supposedly authorized solely through my employee credentials. Even more significant, the recovered transmission log showed that the archived email had been addressed not only to Richard, but also automatically copied to the company's legal compliance mailbox through a background rule created months earlier for sensitive financial concerns. The synchronization failed before the visible email reached anyone's inbox, but the routing information had already been recorded inside the protected archive. That tiny technical detail changed everything. It established that weeks before I was accused of misconduct, I had documented unusual approval patterns involving Richard and attempted to report them through an official internal process. I had not been trying to hide financial activity. I had been trying to question it. Daniel looked at me quietly before closing the folder. "This is no longer just evidence that helps your defense," he said. "This changes the entire timeline. For the first time since my career collapsed, the facts no longer pointed only toward me. They pointed backward, revealing a sequence of events that made far more sense than the company's original story. First, I discovered irregular approval patterns. Then I unknowingly prepared documentation identifying them. Shortly afterward, I received a replacement company phone, leaving the message unfinished. Weeks later, I became the central suspect in a fraud investigation built around my own credentials. None of that proved every detail of the conspiracy, but it established something impossible to ignore. I had become a target only after I moved dangerously close to information someone desperately wanted buried. As Daniel secured certified copies of the recovered archive for the upcoming hearing, I realized the forgotten message had done exactly what I originally intended years earlier. It had quietly preserved the truth until the day someone finally knew where to look. The special meeting of Hawthorne Financial's executive board was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a rainy Wednesday morning, exactly 5 weeks after I had been escorted out of the building under suspicion. I arrived with Daniel Brooks 30 minutes early, carrying nothing except a legal notebook. The certified archive copies remained locked inside Daniel's briefcase because he insisted the evidence should speak before emotions ever had the chance. Walking back through the same lobby felt surreal. The receptionist who had smiled at me every morning for nearly a decade now looked surprised to see me. Several employees glanced in my direction before quietly whispering to one another. Their expressions were different this time. They were no longer filled with certainty. They were filled with curiosity. Word had spread that the investigation had taken an unexpected turn. Inside the executive conference room sat members of the board, outside legal counsel, representatives from internal audit, and Richard Holloway. He appeared as polished as ever in a perfectly tailored Navy suit, greeting board members with calm confidence. When our eyes briefly met across the room, he offered the same reassuring smile that had once convinced me he was a trustworthy mentor. This time I saw something different beneath it. His confidence depended on everyone believing the version of events he had carefully constructed. The meeting began with the chairwoman thanking everyone for their cooperation before inviting internal audit to summarize its findings. The lead investigator reviewed the evidence that had originally implicated me: unauthorized transfers, authentication records, badge access logs, surveillance images. Listening to the presentation, I understood why everyone had believed I was guilty. The evidence had been organized so neatly that questioning it almost seemed unreasonable. When the presentation concluded, Richard spoke with measured professionalism. He expressed disappointment that a trusted employee had allegedly violated company standards while emphasizing the importance of accountability regardless of someone's position. Several board members nodded in agreement. Then Daniel quietly stood. "Before any conclusions are reached," he said, "there is newly recovered evidence preserved through the company's own disaster recovery archive under court supervision." The room immediately became silent. Daniel distributed certified copies of the recovered synchronization records, the archived email, and the restored attachment to every board member, the company's outside counsel, and internal audit. No dramatic speeches followed. No accusations. Only documents. One by one, people turned the pages. I watched their expressions change almost simultaneously. Curiosity became confusion. Confusion became concern. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses and reread one section twice before looking toward internal audit. "Is this archive authentic?" she asked. The lead investigator answered carefully. Yes, it was recovered independently under legal supervision. We have verified its integrity. Daniel then highlighted the routing metadata showing that weeks before the investigation ever began, I had prepared an internal report questioning unusual executive authorization patterns involving Richard Holloway. More importantly, the archive transmission log proved the report had been queued for automatic delivery to both Richard and the legal compliance mailbox before synchronization failed because of the replacement company phone. I had not hidden evidence. I had unknowingly preserved it. Richard finally spoke, his voice remaining calm, but noticeably less certain than before. He suggested the archived records could have been misunderstood or taken out of context. Daniel simply turned to another page inside the recovered attachment where the executive authorization token associated with Richard appeared repeatedly beside the questioned transactions. Outside counsel requested permission to compare those identifiers with the company's secure authorization database. Information technology confirmed the identifiers matched exactly. No one said another word for several long seconds. The silence inside that conference room carried more weight than any argument ever could. The chairwoman slowly closed the folder before addressing internal audit again. Based on this new information, is your original conclusion still supported? The investigator took a deep breath before answering honestly. No. The recovered archive significantly changes both the sequence of events and the focus of the investigation. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday, every eye in the room turned away from me and toward Richard Holloway. His composed expression finally cracked. It was only for an instant, but after weeks of watching everyone question my integrity, I recognized exactly what I was seeing. It was the face of someone realizing that control had quietly slipped away. The forgotten records had not merely challenged the accusation against me. They had forced everyone in that room to ask a far more important question. If I had been trying to report suspicious financial activity before becoming the primary suspect, then who truly benefited from making sure my warning was never heard? The board meeting ended without the dramatic speeches I once imagined would accompany justice. Instead, it concluded with quiet decisions that carried enormous consequences. Outside counsel recommended that the investigation immediately shift its focus from me to every financial authorization connected to Richard Holloway over the previous 5 years. The board unanimously approved the recommendation. Richard attempted to object, insisting that isolated technical records had been misinterpreted, but this time no one interrupted to support him. The same executives who had accepted every word he spoke only minutes earlier now asked him direct questions that he could no longer answer with polished confidence. His administrative access was suspended before the meeting even adjourned. His company laptop, identification badge, and executive credentials were collected using the exact same procedures that had once been used against me. Watching that moment brought no satisfaction. It only reminded me how quickly an organization could mistake procedure for truth. During the weeks that followed, independent forensic accountants reviewed thousands of transactions, archived approvals, and vendor contracts. The investigation uncovered a pattern remarkably similar to the one Linda Foster had described. Multiple consulting agreements had been divided into smaller payments to avoid additional executive review, while authorization records had been manipulated to create the appearance of routine compliance. The recovered synchronization archive became the starting point that connected years of overlooked financial activity into a single timeline. Investigators eventually concluded that I had attempted to question those irregularities long before anyone accused me of wrongdoing. My suspension was officially withdrawn, and Hawthorne Financial issued a written statement confirming that I had been fully cleared of all allegations. Another statement acknowledged serious failures in the company's internal investigative process and promised significant reforms to strengthen oversight and evidence preservation. Within days, my professional reputation began returning faster than I ever expected. Recruiters who had quietly disappeared started calling again. Former coworkers sent messages apologizing for believing the worst before hearing my side of the story. Some admitted they had wanted to support me, but feared risking their own careers. I understood their silence better than I expected. Fear often spreads faster than facts. A week later, the chairwoman of the board invited me back to headquarters for a private meeting. She apologized personally for everything that had happened and offered to reinstate my position immediately, along with the promotion that had been interrupted. The salary increase remained available, the benefits would be fully restored, and the company was prepared to compensate me for the weeks I had spent under investigation. It was an offer I had dreamed about only a month earlier. Yet as I looked out through the conference room window, toward the same hallway where my career had collapsed, I realized something inside me had permanently changed. "I appreciate everything you are offering," I said sincerely, "but I cannot rebuild trust in the same place where it disappeared so easily." The chairwoman nodded with quiet understanding. She did not argue. She simply wished me well. Emily smiled the entire drive home after I told her my decision. Instead of returning to Hawthorne Financial, I accepted an invitation from a respected consulting firm specializing in corporate compliance and financial risk management. Ironically, my experience made me uniquely qualified to help other companies strengthen internal controls and protect honest employees from the kind of failure I had survived. Linda eventually joined the same firm as a senior compliance advisor, and together we helped organizations improve reporting systems so concerns could never again disappear because of overlooked technical failures or ignored warning signs. Mark Ellis remained at Hawthorne Financial after new leadership completely reorganized the information technology department, and every so often we met for coffee, grateful that one quiet conversation had helped preserve the truth. Looking back now, people often ask what finally saved my career. They expect me to mention an attorney, a courtroom, or a brilliant legal strategy. The real answer is much simpler. Years earlier, I had tried to do the right thing without knowing whether anyone would ever listen. A forgotten company phone preserved an unfinished message. A disaster recovery archive quietly protected information no one realized still existed. And one overlooked piece of digital evidence survived long enough to remind everyone that the truth does not disappear simply because someone powerful wants it forgotten. Careers can be rebuilt. Reputations can recover. But the lesson I carry with me every day is one I will never forget. Integrity is rarely tested when everything is going well. It is tested when telling the truth costs you everything, and you choose to tell it anyway.